Okay, welcome everyone. We are starting our second discussion about Book 2 of Herodotus, the Egyptian-focused chapter of Herodotus's history. And so we have some students here to represent your smaller groups and discuss a little bit about what your groups talked about. And so I don't know who wants to go first.
We can go first.
Okay, Southwestern, jumping in. Be sure to say your names and your group names so we know who you're representing. That would be great. Yeah. All right, you are on.
All right. My name is Connor Joyce, and I'm in Croesus. Just to talk a little bit about what our group discussed. We started talking about this book 2, first trying to figure out what Herodotus's perception of the Egyptian people, the Egyptian culture was, and then asking the question why his perception was such. And so the general consensus among the groups and the individuals that posted was that Herodotus did have a very positive view of the Egyptian culture, and he had a very ambivalent view of the Egyptian people. And so that being covered, the next thing that we discussed was whether or not there was a purpose behind this book 2, whether it was just a intellectual digression or whether there was a more overarching broad theme that it worked into. And so we started talking about the Egyptian people in regards to Herodotus's discussion of religion and the gods, and how he believes the Greek people received their names of their gods from the Egyptian people. And so we asked the question, why did he make that claim? Why did he have that view of the Egyptian people? And so we had one individual in the group that argued that it was a genuine conviction on the part of Herodotus, that he did indeed, by going to Egypt, seeing their religious structure, record a religious structure that was similar to his, and genuinely was of the conviction that the Egyptian gods originated or began, or transferred the names rather, to the Greek people. And then in my analysis, I made the argument that perhaps Herodotus was taken with the Egyptian culture, and that his argument that the Greek people received their gods from the Egyptian people was a logical extension, rather a logical necessity, in that the Greek people, in order to have a favorable view of a non-Greek individual, or Herodotus in this instance, in order to have a favorable view of the non-Greek individual, had to have some shared common Greek culture. And so he had to, by necessity, extend this religious similarity to the Greek, or to the Egyptian people, in order to share or have this favorable view of them. So those were the two kind of competing arguments on that front. And then in addition to that, like I said, we talked about what book 2 played in the larger scheme of the book, and whether or not this was just an intellectual digression or whether it had a purpose. And so Aaron, who is actually sitting behind me, also in Croesus, he argued that perhaps there were 2 explanations for why to include book 2. The first was to perhaps build up the reputation of Egypt, so that in book 3, when Persia defeats Egypt, it makes that defeat all that more striking, and then the eventual defeat of Persia by Greece all that more victorious and praiseworthy. So that was one theory that he put forward. Another theory that he put forward is perhaps this favorable view that Herodotus has of the Egyptian people is due to the fact that both the Egyptians and the Greek people were or will be in Book 3 oppressed by the Persian Empire. And so maybe there's a shared camaraderie among the two nations that Herodotus is drawing from. So that was most of our discussion. We did, in addition to that, talk about, like I mentioned before, Herodotus's perception of the Greeks in relation to the non-Greeks. And we did have an interesting discussion in class today about a similar, or not similar instance, but another instance in which Herodotus talks about a non-Greek people, because we were asking the question, is Herodotus simply favorable of non-Greek cultures that are similar to the Greek people? Actually, Aaron had a really good point about the Lydians. So you want to go ahead and talk about that?
Yeah, so basically one of the things we talked about in class today was how Herodotus portrays Greekness as almost like the key to national glory or prowess. And so with the Lydians, you saw this progression in Herodotus's portrayal of them from non-Greek to as Croesus begins to make offerings and dedications to the oracle at Delphi, and kind of Hellenizes the Lydians, that then their prestige and their wealth and their greatness expands along with that. And then another example from Book 1 was the Pelasgians, I think that's how you pronounce it. Who he says, until they acquired the Greek language, really had done nothing of import yet. So the Greekness really does seem to be the ultimate goal of national greatness.
Yeah, so that was the basic outline of the Croesus discussion. But yeah, that kind of concludes it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay. I don't know who wants to go next. Or just to point out that many of your groups also discussed this issue of how Herodotus portrays the Greeks and why he might portray them in a positive way. So feel free to add comments. I see some already coming through on the chat room about Connor's summary of the Croesus group. Let's see. Let's move over to who wants to go next. All right. And go ahead and say your name and what group you're representing.
I'm Joe Spielis. I'm the grad student from Findlay representing the Cyrus group on behalf of Haley Cackett, who works Tuesday and Thursday night, but she scripted out our discussion from the week. So I guess I'll get right into it. So the two things that we really talked about or focused on this week was the interpretation of Herodotus of Homer's, I guess, reinterpretation or outsider viewpoint of the Trojan War, and that was very kind of evidentiary that he was a logically based writer and explorer of stories, so that he didn't see the logic in fighting a whole war and having a city be sacked for the sake of one woman, that it made much more sense that she would have traveled and been somewhere else. And then that kind of translated into the other discussion that we focused on, being the possibility that Herodotus was being given the tourist version of stories and the history of the different places that he visited. And so there was some discussion about what it means to be given the tourist version of a story. Does that mean that people of different countries and different areas willfully lie just to have fun at a foreigner's expense? Or is it that stories naturally grow through embellishments and over time? And so what he was hearing was the progression of storytelling over years and years by the locals, and because that was the new and accepted version of story over time, that he would be hearing something that may not necessarily have been 100% true anymore, but had a basis in fact. And there seemed to be a consensus among the group that Herodotus, as a kind of a logical thinker and a very savvy individual, as he would have had to have been to have traveled so far in the ancient world, would not have been taken in by tall tales, but just repeatedly made efforts to record things as he had been told, to keep the integrity of the story there, whether or not he believed them to be 100% true or not. And that's pretty much where our whole discussion went for this week. So
Thank you, Joe. Thank you for reading for Haley too. That's very helpful. It's
absolutely.
good to see your face too, but too bad Haley can't be here, but that was good. And that is another topic that ran through the groups of stemming from last Thursday's discussion. If Herodotus is a tourist, how trustworthy is tourist information? I don't know. That's a good, we're always going to be thinking about Herodotus and his sources, and thinking of him as a tourist colors that a little bit as well, but it doesn't mean he's getting all his facts wrong either. I liked the point that the Cyrus group brought up, this idea that Herodotus isn't, he's world traveled, he has some experience, he's not going to be taken in by tall tales. That was a good point. All right, who would like to be next? I think Eric or Jackson, either one of you are welcome to start.
Howdy.
Eric, jumping in? All right.
This is me speaking for the Diakes group. We got a prompt this week, probably because our chat wasn't very lively. And it was examining the possible bias Herodotus might have for or against the Egyptians. And I think the consensus was clearly that Herodotus is very impressed by the Egyptians, mainly because, well, for a couple reasons. He's especially impressed with their written records. He places a great deal of importance on the history that the Egyptians have set down in writing or engraving. He notes the genealogy of Egyptian kings. They have stretching back millennia. The separate written languages of religious and secular life, the engraving on the pyramids that he had interpreted. And he places so much credibility or so much faith in something that's written down compared to imparted to him orally, that leads him to lend greater credence to Egyptian records over Greek records. So he goes as far as when he hears from the Egyptian priests, for example, that Helen had not, in fact, gone to Troy, that Helen was waiting around in Egypt for 10 years because they have all these written records. He goes straight toward revising Homer, which you would think would be the next best thing to a sacred text to Herodotus. But no, look right here. The Egyptians have it written down. Helen was in Egypt. And it's only, so he lends great credence to Egyptian sources, and it's only when the Egyptians themselves are imparting information to him orally that he begins to doubt them again, like the accounts of the Nile above Elephantine, something. And when people theorize to Herodotus about the reason for the annual flooding of the Nile, he also doubts and in fact embarks on his own kind of theorizing, his own system of meteorology instead of believing one of three accounts, including this wild and improbable notion that it sometimes rains in the Ethiopian highlands and causes the Nile to flood. So yeah, let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, mainly a pretty solid consensus that Herodotus, if a bias exists, then it is a bias toward Egyptian rather than Greek sources.
Okay, thank you very much, Eric, for representing the diocese group. And again, this question of sources and how Herodotus evaluates them is always going to come up. Eric made a good point about the written sources. Sometimes we think of that as sort of a modern bias in the age of, or relatively modern age of literacy, that things written have more weight than in the oral culture of Herodotus's day. But it's neat that the group noticed that favoring of written sources in the Egyptian account. So watch for that as a evaluative tool of Herodotus in the future too, of where written things carry more weight than oral accounts. So let's see if that holds true when he gets closer to contemporary events in his own time. All right, and Jackson, I think you are up. No, we can't hear you. We'll give Jackson a minute there. All right. We'll just give Jackson a minute to see if his mic works. Be sure to be following these great conversations in the chat room about the topics that you're bringing up in your groups. Let's see, Bobby just posted a good thought question about subtle biases like exoticism of the Egyptians. Like, is that a reason that Herodotus is enamored with the Egyptians, just that they are exotic, and could lead him to liking them more, maybe? All right. Jackson, you want to give it another go? No. It might require restarting your computer, unfortunately. Yeah, if it's a mic in the computer problem. Let me see if maybe if Grant wants to if Jackson wants to restart his computer and join us again, we could do that. Oh, let me see if I can share what Jackson has to say via the chat room. Yeah, it could be, unplugging the headphones might work. I don't know. Let's see. I don't know, technical difficulties. If you want to summarize in the chat room, Jackson, that would be fine as well. Just give a couple of highlights of things that you're, in a couple sentences, that your group talked about, just so we hear a little bit from the Astyages group. And I see, Grant, that you joined us. You don't have to speak, but if you'd like to, I see that Grant is in the hangout, so I want to give him an opportunity to speak if he wants. Grant, do you have anything to add?
Can you hear me?
Yes, can.
Mostly I'm just a little lost as to what the topic is supposed to be. Because I thought it was just book 2, but I've seen in the chat a fair amount of things related a lot more to book 1.
I muted myself. I think that we are mainly talking about the Egyptians from book 2, but making some references to conversations that carried over from book 1 about sources and stuff like that. So
Thank you.
yeah, you don't have to share, but you're welcome to.
One of the things my class addressed about the biases Herodotus might be having, or less about them and more how he judges them himself, is kind of how he introduces the second chapter and then what he says about the second chapter by when he transitions to the third one. I think notes I gave myself aren't too good though, so I'll just see if I can summarize that well enough. It was basically that, once again, this is off the top of my head, I don't remember well enough, that that he introduces the sources as, I think he said it was Greek source. I'm sorry, I don't remember what we concluded on, and I didn't write it down. I think he introduced them as Greek sources, but in the third paragraph, he then kind of starts to talk about how he doesn't believe those very sources, but in a very obscure way, I'd call it. How he doesn't actually try. He actually doesn't try to address the. He doesn't actually try to address the people, or entirely the story. He just kind of. Sorry, I'm not. These thoughts just aren't complete. Sorry.
No worries, Grant. Thank you for participating, because that is a good point of when he dismisses something as not being a good source. We want to understand why and pay attention to why. And so that sometimes he does those little asides that you pointed out in the beginning of book, at the beginning of book 2, of where he sort of dismisses the Greek sources in favor of the Egyptian, maybe building off of stuff Eric was also talking about in the diocese group. Thank you everyone for participating. There's a lively chat about about a lot of things, exotic things in particular, and also this question of sources. Going to continue to be part of our conversation, and I'd like to invite anyone else to speak up in our chat room if you have anything to add. Professor Wadden, did you have anything to add?
Well, I was just looking at some of these questions. I think that question about from Cairns about how do you keep all of the with so many characters, how do you prioritize? And I think really at times it just comes down to personal interest, right? I mean, some things I read and I find the stories more interesting. Sotras's wife, I mean, I'm just seeing here there's a comment about the using your sons to build a bridge, right? And I guess that is that's really kind of mad. So when I read something like that, in answer to the question, I think it sometimes it's just subjective. I mean, some characters are going to have a major impact. Croesus, Cyrus, Cambyses, Darius, Xerxes, characters like this are going to be the real big hitters. But at other times, it's just really what is what do you find interesting? There are so many people in there, and so many stories that I think really a lot of times it just comes down to your own personal interest. So I'm see that Norman has given an answer as well. So yeah, personal interest. I think what stories do you find interest when you're reading it? There was one thing, I mentioned this on Thursday, if that's okay, but I just wanted to pick it up again because we read the section in class and looked at it. And I really like that part of the beginning section of book 2, where Herodotus describes the landscape, and he talks about the Nile Delta gradually building up, and how he kind of believes that the Nile was originally a branch of the sea, but that as the Nile brought all this silt down, it gradually built up and turned it into dry land. But then he worries about the future. He says, you know, in 1,000 or 10,000 years, if this continues, then the land will get so high that they won't be able to grow crops on it anymore. And I think that kind of awareness of environmental change, and I know I'm kind of repeating myself from Thursday, but this is one of those stories that just really grabbed me about his awareness of environmental change, and that long-term look I find really interesting. And I'll stop now.
No, that's very interesting, and how it is a lesson in how to read quickly and see what grabs you, to sort of skim, because if you try to keep everything straight, as the question that started this discussion came up, is if you try to get all the details and read it like a history book, as if you were going to take an exam. I hope nobody's reading it that way. We're trying to read it a little more literary, and see what grabs you. If you try to get all the details and the names and the relationships too carefully, you sort of miss the point of enjoying this as more of a literary work. And so looking for those things that grab you, we're trying to find some patterns, and I think in your groups and as well as our discussion here, we are seeing some of those patterns. Professor Sandridge pointed out this, thinking of these leaders and what is Herodotus interested in finding out about these people. So when you see him highlighting certain factors about a person, about a leader, you know that that person's important. But if he's not giving a whole lot of detail, not the most important character, you can assume. Professor Haskell also pointed out about catching interest, curiosities, noting those, and then we can sort of look for big picture characters and events that invite further analysis. Let's see, I did want to finish.
Gwen, would you mind if I pitched in one more time?
Oh, yes.
Hello.
Sorry, my dog really wants to be part of this class, and he's usually good, as you noticed, for the first half hour. All right, let me pass.
I was just going to mention that one of the things we spoke about, and again, this goes back to the question of which bits are important and interesting. And in class the other day, one of our students, Maggie, I don't know if she's on the chat, but she said she found interesting the times when Herodotus says, I'm not going to say this bit. So it's not actually what he does says, it's just she was talking about trying to find a pattern to see what are the things that he can't talk about. Is there some sort of pattern when it gets to those stages and he says, well, I know this story, but I'm not going to tell it. So it is really about personal interest, and whether it's what's in there or even what's not in there. It's just what kind of, you're curious about yourself.
Excellent, thank you. I want to leave on one final student note, since Jackson didn't get to speak because of technical difficulties. I did want to point out a very interesting conversation that he summarized for us. He said that the Astyages group mostly talked about the way Egyptians view women. And according to Herodotus, Egyptian women did the opposite of what Greek women did. And so that is a different way of that question of how is he portraying women, and is there a difference as he shifts cultures? That's another way to frame your interest in a way. So that was a great, don't worry about the technical difficulties. That was a great point, because it was something a little different in that group, that topic of women. So I wanted to throw that out there, and that was definitely a very interesting conversation that group had. So keep looking for those ways of framing how you're reading. And let's see, we will move on to book 3 on Thursday. So please join us again for Common Session 3A, and keep chatting in the chat room, and we'll see you next week. Thank you to everyone who participated. It's always good to see all your faces. All right, have a good night.